Morning, everyone. Thanks to our witnesses for joining us today. Thanks to all the members for participating. Again, I want to thank Representative Kelly for her leadership. And I want to thank Representatives Presley and Ocasio-Cortez also for joining in this critical work of combating intimate partner violence and advocating for missing women and children throughout the country. This is a crisis that is hiding in plain sight, and I hope the hearing will help us to shine a light on the shocking plague of missing and murdered women and girls in communities of color across the country. In 2020, 100,000 of the 250,000 women and girls who went missing in the U.S. were Black, Brown, or Indigenous. Black women and girls make up just 13% of the female population in the country, but accounted for fully 35% of all missing women in 2020. This crisis is dire in Indigenous communities. In South Dakota, 2 of 3 missing persons are Native American, despite only 1 of 10 South Dakotans being Native American. In Montana, Native Americans account for 1 of every 4 missing persons, despite only 1 of every 20 Montanans being Native American. These numbers don't even reflect the full extent of the epidemic. According to the GAO, the total number of missing and murdered Indigenous women is still unknown. Federal databases do not contain comprehensive nationwide data. The data that is collected includes Hispanic and Latina women among white women, leaving their numbers also mysterious. Missing women from immigrant communities also go unreported and uncounted out of fear of deportation. The causes driving the disproportionate rates of missing women of color are many and complex. Intimate partner violence affects nearly half of African American and Indigenous women, compared to 37% of white women. Unfortunately, fewer than 20% of all women who face intimate partner violence seek services, which only perpetuates the cycle of violence. Sex trafficking also drives these disproportionate numbers. Nearly 2/3 of sex trafficking victims in this country are Black and Latina or Hispanic. The numbers are just as dire for Native women. In South Dakota, Native American women and girls constitute 40% of victims of sex trafficking. Native women also face unique dangers. So-called man camps, temporary housing for pipeline and oil industry laborers, affect Indigenous and other marginalized communities in rural areas where they're located. Studies have shown that the placement of man camps statistically coincide with dramatically significant increases in crime. For example, the Fort Berthold Reservation saw a 75% increase in sexual assaults on Native women after man camps arose in their region during the oil construction boom of the late 2000s. Notably, there was no corresponding rise in crime outside of this area. Unfortunately, these communities are structurally hamstrung in their response to such threats. Tribal law enforcement is prohibited from prosecuting non-Native individuals who commit crimes against their people. Local law enforcement often has limited resources, spread thin, and may be hesitant to engage with jurisdictional uncertainty. Federal law enforcement has not been able to step into the gaps. They may have a geographically limited presence to investigate and prosecute serious crimes against Native communities. Even so, in 2017, U.S. attorneys declined to prosecute over 1 in 3 of their cases arising in Indian country, primarily citing a lack of evidence. Jurisdictional wrangling and limited resources often lead to significant delays. The first 24 to 48 hours in a missing persons case is critical, and poor communication between law enforcement agencies can make the difference between life and death. The neglect shown by the media towards cases involving missing and murdered women of color is a primary reason that this epidemic remains obscure to the public. Countless families in these communities shoulder the burden of a missing loved one alone. Countless others shoulder the additional trauma of a law enforcement system that discounts their fears and their experience. Just one example here. In Wyoming, out of the more than 700 Indigenous women who've gone missing in the last 10 years, less than 1 in 5 received any media coverage. How is that possible? So we are here today to render visible this invisible crisis in our midst. Congress and the Biden administration have taken some important preliminary steps to clarify the epidemic of missing and murdered women of color. Savannah's Act, the Ashland Mike Amber Alert in Indian Country Act, and the Ashanti Alert Act have all been enacted into law. There have been executive orders, but we have more work to do. We must act to ensure that federal law enforcement is fully coordinating with the Western states that have created missing and murdered Indigenous women task forces. The administration needs to constitute the Joint Commission on Reducing Violence Against Indians. Congress must reauthorize the Violence Against Women Act and the Frederick Douglass Trafficking Victims Prevention and Protection Act and fully fund implementation of the Ashanti Alert Act. Finally, we must consider the Protect Black Women and Girls Act introduced by my friend and our distinguished colleague, Congresswoman Kelly. We must work together to confront and address this pressing problem. The core function of government is to protect the safety and the security of the people. That's the essence of the social contract. We have to secure and fortify the social contract for women of color all across America. I look forward to hearing the testimony of our witnesses today, and I yield back to you, Ms. Kelly.